Nissan MID4 is one of those cars that could have completely changed the history of Japanese supercars, but instead became trapped in a chapter called What If? Imagine the middle of the 1980s. Ferrari had the Testarossa, Lotus was building the Esprit, Porsche was developing increasingly advanced performance machines, and Honda was only beginning to prepare what would later become the NSX. Then, Nissan revealed something nobody expected from the company. A low, wide, mid-engined coupe with all-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, a V6 mounted behind the driver, and technology that would later shape some of the most legendary performance cars in the company's history. The MID4 was not merely a flashy show car built to sit under bright lights at a motor show. It was a rolling laboratory, an almost production-ready prototype, and a preview of what a Japanese exotic sports car could have become years before the NSX appeared. Its name stood for mid-engine four-wheel drive, and that description alone sounded futuristic in 1985. The tragedy is that Nissan ultimately decided not to build it. Only a handful of prototypes were ever made, and today their value is almost impossible to estimate because the cars never existed on the normal collector market. If one of the MID4 or MID4-2 prototypes ever appeared at a major auction today, it would almost certainly command several $1 million. These were not just concepts. They were the technological ancestors of the Skyline GTR R32 and the 300ZX Z32, two of the most iconic Japanese performance cars ever created. The story of the MID4 began during a unique moment in Japanese automotive history. The 1980s were a period of enormous economic growth for Japan, a time when the country's manufacturers became confident enough to challenge Europe directly, not only in reliability and mass production, but also in prestige and performance. Nissan had already transformed its global image with the success of the original Fairlady Z and Datsun 240Z. Those cars proved that Japan could build sports cars that were attractive, quick, reliable, and affordable. The Z car line continued to evolve throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, eventually becoming the 300ZX, but Nissan wanted more. The company did not simply want to compete with mainstream coupes anymore. It wanted to challenge Ferrari, Porsche, Lamborghini, and Lotus on their own ground. Nissan envisioned a halo car that would demonstrate the company's engineering capabilities and elevate its brand image to a completely new level. Work on the MID4 reportedly began in early 1984 under the leadership of Shinichiro Sakurai, the legendary engineer associated with the Skyline lineage. That connection would later prove extremely important because many of the technologies developed for the MID4 would eventually become part of the Skyline GTR program. In many ways, the MID4 was the missing evolutionary link between Nissan's earlier sports cars and the technological monsters that would dominate the company's future. The original Nissan MID4 was unveiled at the 1985 Frankfurt Motor Show, and the choice of venue was highly symbolic. Nissan did not introduce the car only in Japan for a domestic audience. Instead, it brought the prototype directly into Europe, into the territory of Ferrari, Porsche, and Lotus. Stylistically, the MID4 looked exactly like the kind of futuristic sports car people dreamed about during the mid-1980s. It had sharp wedge-shaped lines, pop-up headlights, dramatic proportions, a compact cabin pushed forward, and a broad rear section covering the mid-mounted engine. Some observers saw similarities to the Ferrari Testarossa. Others compared it to the Lotus Esprit or Porsche 944, but the MID4 still possessed its own unique identity. The rear design was especially memorable, with flying buttresses, slatted vents, futuristic surfaces, and a shape that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film. One of the most fascinating aspects of the MID4 was how realistic it appeared. Unlike many concept cars, it did not look impossible to manufacture. It had normal mirrors, realistic wheels, practical bumpers, windshield wipers, functional windows, and an interior that appeared almost ready for production. This was not some wild fantasy machine designed only to attract headlines. It looked like a car Nissan genuinely intended to build. That realism is part of the reason why the MID4 remains so captivating today. It felt achievable. Underneath the bodywork, the MID4 was even more impressive. Nissan installed a transversely mounted 3-liter VG30DE V6 engine directly behind the seats. The engine featured dual overhead camshafts and 24 valves, making it one of the company's most advanced power plants at the time. Depending on the source, output was listed at roughly 242 to 245 horsepower. Today that may not sound extraordinary, but in 1985 it was a serious figure for a lightweight Japanese sports car. The MID4 weighed approximately 1,230 kilograms, giving it performance comparable to many contemporary European sports cars. Nissan claimed a top speed of roughly 249 kilometers per hour and a 0 to 100 kilometers per hour time of around 5.5 seconds. More importantly, the engine was paired with a permanent all-wheel drive system that distributed power approximately 33% to the front axle and 67% to the rear. This system was the direct precursor to Atessa, the advanced all-wheel drive technology that would later become legendary in the Skyline GT-R R32. In other words, the MID4 was not just a prototype supercar. It was also the birthplace of one of Nissan's most important performance technologies. Another groundbreaking feature was Nissan's new hypercars 4-wheel steering system. Today, rear-wheel steering is often presented as advanced modern technology, but Nissan was experimenting with it nearly 4 decades ago. The MID4 became the first Nissan to showcase hypercars in such an advanced form. The rear wheels could turn slightly, either in the same direction or the opposite direction as the front wheels, depending on speed and driving conditions. This improved both stability at high speeds and agility during cornering. The system was not merely a gimmick. It was a serious attempt to make the MID4 handle more predictably and efficiently, despite its mid-engine layout and advanced drivetrain. The suspension itself was also highly sophisticated, using double wishbones at the front and a multi-link arrangement at the rear. Ventilated disc brakes with ABS were fitted on all 4 corners. Nissan wanted the MID4 to demonstrate not only speed, but also technological intelligence. The company was effectively building a rolling showcase for the future of its performance engineering. The combination of all-wheel drive, 4-wheel steering, advanced suspension geometry, and a mid-mounted V6 made the MID4 one of the most technologically ambitious sports cars of the decade. The interior further reinforced the impression that the MID4 was more than a simple design exercise. Unlike many concept cars that featured unrealistic dashboards or impractical futuristic controls, the MID4 cabin looked genuinely usable. The driver sat low in a supportive seat, facing a traditional instrument cluster and a dashboard that appeared surprisingly close to production-ready. The center console was high and angled toward the driver, creating a cockpit-like atmosphere. Nissan clearly intended the MID4 to be a car that could function on real roads rather than just on an auto show turntable. In many ways, the philosophy behind the MID4 foreshadowed what Honda would later accomplish with the NSX, a high-performance exotic sports car that was still practical and approachable enough for daily use. The difference, of course, is that Honda ultimately committed to production while Nissan stepped away. Had the MID4 entered production, it might have become the world's first mass-produced Japanese mid-engine supercar years before the NSX appeared. That possibility is one of the reasons enthusiasts remain fascinated by it today. Nissan did not abandon the project after the first concept. Instead, the company continued development and returned in 1987 with a dramatically evolved version known as the MID4-2, or MID4 Type 2. This second concept was significantly more mature, both stylistically and mechanically. The sharp, angular lines of the original car were replaced with smoother, more organic surfaces. The front end looked cleaner and more modern, while the rear adopted a broad taillight arrangement and a more integrated design language. Many enthusiasts have noted the resemblance between the MID4 and the later Honda NSX, particularly around the nose and side profile. Whether this was coincidence or indirect inspiration remains impossible to prove, but the similarity is difficult to ignore. The MID4 looked like a genuine supercar, not just a futuristic experiment. If someone unfamiliar with Nissan's history saw it today, they could easily mistake it for an Italian or German exotic from the late 1980s. The most important improvement in the MID4 was the engine. Nissan replaced the naturally aspirated VG30DE with the twin-turbocharged VG30DE TT, the same engine family that would later power the legendary 300ZX twin-turbo ZID32. In the MID4 the engine reportedly produced around 330 horsepower and approximately 281 pound-feet of torque. Those were highly impressive numbers for the period. The car's weight increased to roughly 1,400 kilograms, but performance improved dramatically. Nissan claimed a top speed approaching 295 kilometers per hour and acceleration to 100 kilometers per hour in under 5 seconds. Combined with the all-wheel drive system and HYCAS rear-wheel steering, the MID4 represented a level of technology that few competitors could match in the late 1980s. It was a Japanese answer to Ferrari, Porsche, and eventually Honda. Had it reached production, it would have become one of the most advanced sports cars in the world. Mechanically, the MID4 remained incredibly sophisticated. It retained all-wheel drive and HYCAS, but both systems were refined further. The suspension setup became even more advanced, and the car adopted larger wheels and tires to cope with the increased power. The VG30DE TT engine was mounted longitudinally instead of transversely, improving packaging and allowing room for the twin turbochargers and intercoolers. The body itself was sleek and aerodynamic, with proportions that still look modern today. Many people consider the MID4 more attractive than the original MID4 because it abandoned some of the exaggerated wedge styling of the early 1980s and embraced a cleaner, more timeless shape. The rear deck featured a dramatic power bulge, and the taillight treatment resembled later Nissan sports cars such as the Silvia S14. Even the cabin began to resemble what would eventually appear in the 300ZX Z32. Looking at the MID4 today feels almost surreal because so many later Nissan designs and technologies can be traced directly back to it. Despite all of its promise, the MID4 never entered production. The reason was simple: cost. Nissan realized that building such an advanced mid-engined all-wheel drive sports car would be extremely expensive. The complexity of the drivetrain, the sophisticated suspension, the compact packaging, and the specialized chassis would all have driven the price far beyond what Nissan considered realistic for its customer base. At the same time, the company was already deep into development of the Z32 300ZX and the Skyline GT-R R32. Both of those cars could incorporate much of the MID4 technology while remaining more practical and affordable to produce. From a business standpoint, Nissan likely concluded that spreading MID4 innovations across multiple models made more sense than gambling on a single expensive halo car. Financially, that decision may have been rational. Emotionally, however, it remains heartbreaking for enthusiasts. The MID4 had the potential to become something truly extraordinary. Ironically, although the MID4 itself died, its technological legacy survived and became legendary. The VG30DE and VG30DE TT engines went on to power the 300ZX Z32, one of the greatest Japanese sports cars of the 1990s. The all-wheel drive system evolved into a Tessa, which transformed the Skyline GT-R R32 into an automotive icon. HYCAS rear-wheel steering appeared in Skylines, Fairlady Zs, Silvias, and several other Nissan performance cars. In this sense, the MID4 was not a failure at all. It served as an incubator for technologies that would later define Nissan's golden era of performance engineering. The car sacrificed its own future so that others could succeed. Without the MID4, the Skyline GTR and the 300ZX might have been very different machines. That is why the MID4 deserves far more recognition than it usually receives. It never raced, never entered production, and never became a mainstream legend like the NSX. But its DNA spread throughout Nissan's entire performance lineup. The number of MID4 prototypes built remains somewhat unclear. Most sources agree that several examples of the original MID4 existed, including at least a white left-hand drive prototype and a red right-hand drive version. As for the MID4-2, most historians believe at least 3 examples were constructed: a white show car, a red car, and a gray or titanium-colored test vehicle. Since Nissan never commercialized the project, official production records are limited, and exact figures remain difficult to confirm. Nevertheless, it is safe to say that only a handful of MID4 and MID4-2 prototypes were ever built. That makes them extraordinarily rare. Unlike production supercars, which may exist in hundreds or thousands of units, the MID4 family exists only as a small collection of prototypes, representing a path Nissan ultimately chose not to follow. Estimating the value of a MID4 today is nearly impossible, because the cars have never truly existed on the open collector market. There are no comparable sales and no established valuation benchmarks. However, their historical significance is immense. These prototypes represent the origin point of technologies that later helped define some of Nissan's greatest performance cars. They also symbolize a fascinating alternate timeline in which Nissan could have beaten Honda to the production mid-engine supercar market. If a complete, functioning MID4-2 were ever offered for sale at a major collector auction, it would likely attract enormous attention from enthusiasts, museums, and collectors of Japanese performance cars. A price in the multi-million-dollar range would not be unrealistic, especially considering the recent explosion in value for important Japanese collector vehicles. More importantly, however, the MID4 is essentially priceless from a historical perspective. Nissan itself would almost certainly never willingly part with such an important piece of its engineering heritage. Looking back now, the MID4 and MID4-2 represent one of the greatest what-if stories in automotive history. We know the timeline that actually happened. Honda introduced the NSX, the Skyline GTR became Godzilla, and the 300ZX established itself as one of the defining Japanese sports cars of the 1990s. But there is another possible timeline where Nissan launched the MID4-2 into production before the NSX ever existed. In that alternate reality, Nissan might have become the company most closely associated with Japanese exotic sports cars. The MID4 could have evolved through multiple generations, entered racing programs, and become a direct rival to Ferrari and Porsche. Instead, it became a forgotten legend, a prototype remembered mainly by enthusiasts who dig deeply into automotive history. Today, the MID4 remains one of the most fascinating concept cars Nissan ever created. It combined mid-engine balance, all-wheel drive traction, four-wheel steering, turbocharged power, and advanced suspension technology years before many competitors attempted anything similar. It was ambitious, futuristic, and remarkably close to production reality. Yet it disappeared before it ever had the chance to prove itself. Perhaps that is why the MID4 legend remains so powerful. Had it entered production and failed, it would simply be remembered as a commercial disappointment. Had it succeeded, it would be celebrated as a technological triumph. But because it never reached either outcome, it exists permanently as a mystery, a ghost of a Japanese supercar that almost changed everything.